All right, so some watercolor basics. I do not have one of the smaller palettes like you have. This is one of my personal watercolor palettes, so it has a lot more different colors, but it works the same way. So this is semi-moist watercolor. It's referred to as, each of these little sections of color are referred to as pans or cakes, and it's called semi-moist because once you add water to it, it's immediately soluble. It immediately starts to dissolve and turn into paint that you can spread with a brush. So let's take some blue, just dab a little water, and there's already paint on the brush. So wet on dry is the most direct kind of technique, and it is going to create very sharp edges as the paint dries. You can also, I'm gonna clean my brush, dab it on paper towel a little, do wet on wet. So if you just add some water to the paper, need a little more I think, and then get a little paint, you're gonna get much softer lines as the paint diffuses through the water that's already there. So when you want a really smooth, even field of color, wet on wet is a really great technique to do that because it even smooths out the pigment for you. So, and then to create a gradient, I usually like to start with a little bit of wet on wet and start on one side with more pigment, and then I clean my brush on a paper towel and I just start kind of working it over. I add more water to it at the other end. Maybe add a little more paint to the dark side. Now, watercolor is supposed to be transparent, so don't try to load up your brush with so much pigment that it's completely opaque like acrylic paint. That's not really what it's supposed to do. Dry brush can be a little trickier when you're working with semi-moist like this. Watercolor also comes in tubes where it's like a paste, and that is easier to do dry brush, but you can still achieve it with semi-moist. So you just get a little bit of paint, and you don't want a lot of water on your brush. If your brush is really wet or dripping, just dab it on a paper towel. And then you saw I kind of spread out the bristles on my brush some, and you get a rougher, more open texture. You really see the brush strokes with dry brush. All right, so I did wet on just dry paper here, but now I want to show you what wet on dry paint looks like. So I got some orange on my brush now, and it still has those dark edges. In comparison, if I have wet paint Ooh, that was a little much. I have wet paint, and then I put, mix some red in that. Wet paint on top of it, it diffuses through it. So you can create some nice gradients of color, fading from one color to the next, blending colors together through this method, through using wet on wet. And also, watch what happens when I add a drip of just clean water onto the wet paint. It pushes the pigment, the colored paint, out of the way, and you can get some really interesting textures and designs with that. Let's see. Mixing colors, so you can mix colors right on the page like I did here. Wet on wet, they're actually going to blend. If you layer them wet on dry, you get that kind of transparency effect. See how the orange here is much duller than it is when I put it just straight on the white paper, because it's transparent. Well, technically it's translucent. It's not totally see-through, it's slightly see-through, a little see-through. So it's blending with the blue. Kind of like if you put orange glass on top of blue glass. And because orange and blue are complementary colors, they desaturate one another. So you get this kind of darker, a little more brown orange than when it's just pure only on the white. You can also mix your colors on a palette, really just any kind of plastic will work, even tin foil. So you just add some water, dab it till you get some paint on your brush, and put it over there. Let's get a little more. Kind of brush it on the side, or even sometimes you can drip it out, or if you get your brush more wet, add a little more water to it. And then, let's see, let's make a blue-green. So I'm gonna add some green to this blue. And you can mix your colors on the palette also before applying it to the paper. See right here, I have a little bit of a transparency, but here where the wet green paint, I accidentally touched this orange paint that was still wet, and you see how it blended into it, it fused into it. So if you want clean edges, it has to be wet on dry. If you touch anything that is still wet, even if the paper is still a little bit damp, it's going to have softer lines, softer edges. It's going to have softer edges. Let's see. You can also get a sponge or a paper towel. And pick paint back up. Yeah, so that really is the very basics of watercolor.